There's a lot of interest in intermittent fasting and skipping meals. And it's really interesting that you see quite variable outcomes depending on what we're looking at and how we're looking at it. So, for such a long time, we've heard that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And when you really drill into that, you see that there's a correlation that people eat breakfast tend to make healthier choices later on in the day, but it's not proving that breakfast in particular is the answer. Most of the studies I've seen on intermittent fasting and potential benefits look at eating earlier in the day. So generally speaking, a breakfast and a lunch, but skipping dinner, late night snacking, not eating again until the next morning. And sometimes you'll see some benefits there in terms of metabolic health, and sometimes you won't. I think that's the lived experience of most people who've tried it. But what I see most people doing is not eating breakfast, eating some kind of a meal in the middle of the day, although it might be still late in the afternoon when they're hangry. And ultimately, a lot of people end up overeating when they do that. So they end up eating a lot of calories later in the day, and that doesn't end up being so good for metabolic health. When we look at insulin and cortisol levels, which we don't look at all day, every day, but if you were to track it out on somebody on an hourly basis too, you would see that different foods and different stress levels, have different outcomes at different times of the day. So you might eat a meal at one time of day and it affects you slightly differently than if you eat it at a different time of day. We don't have enough, I think, good information to be able to turn that into practical advice. But I would generally say that I don't typically advise intermittent fasting because I think a lot of people end up doing it in a way that does not work. When you look at health outcomes of cultures that have traditionally used fasting, the way that they're doing it is quite different. And often there isn't a binge component when the fasting is over. But I think what we see in the way that a lot of people practice it, especially if you have a tendency towards binge eating, stress eating, overeating, is that a lot of people end up overdoing it when they do return to eating. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, especially people who do have binge eating habits or binge eating disorder, whether or not it's been diagnosed, it can really set up patterns of worse binges. And we don't talk enough about binge eating disorder and the impact it has on people. It's often a behavior that's quite secretive, but it's really important that we don't do things that make that worse.